2 months ago, my brother as a manager and I as a programmer and designer decided to embark on this great adventure of creating our first major video game. And when I say major video game, it's because we're not talking about the typical 24-hour development for a game jam or a week for a frustrated project that starts but never finishes. No. This time we have indeed made the decision to see it through to the end, no matter what happens. And it's stated here in this first devlog. So you can hold it against us if we don't follow through in the end. First of all, let me give you some context. One day, while cleaning the attic of our house, we came across a hidden gem, a lost treasure, a Scalextric.
Wow!
And for those who are not familiar with the brand, these were a series of miniature electric-powered cars and tracks to form circuits that you could then race on, experiencing the best races in history with family and friends. That feeling of nostalgia combined with the need to experience it without taking up half the house, every time you wanted to play, gave us the idea of why not make a video game out of this? And the answer was, when do we start? And now, here we are with our first big project in hand and a terrible lack of sleep. But of course, fulfilling our dream. But before continuing with the devlog, I'll explain what our game is about. Speed Rivals is a rail-based car racing game with multiple game modes to enjoy and compete like in the old days. But with all the advantages of a video game, so that the younger ones can feel what we felt back in the day. And the more experienced players can relive that nostalgia, just as we did when we took that Scalextric down from the attic. And highlighting certain aspects of the video game, you can create your own tracks, collect and customize cars of all kinds, and experience iconic races from the motor world in this rail format. So exciting. And like in every good video game story, it all starts with a small, ugly, and not at all fun demo. But it gives an idea of what we want to achieve. No. Okay, maybe not. How about this? Better not. I think it's understood better. And, well, the process wasn't simple. The first thing was a rail system for the cars to have something to run on. And for this case, the best approach was to use splines to define the layout of any circuit. So that was the first thing I did. I got to work and came up with a first version, which, well, let's say it was neither the most optimal nor the easiest to use. But the concept was there. Now, with all these points, I just had to add a series of handles to give the curvature I needed. And, after a lot of brain work, trying to squeeze 100% of my brain capacity, we ended up with a much more accurate result that undoubtedly fulfilled its purpose. Now I could map out any circuit and traverse the points to move the car along the curve. And it worked. Or what did you expect? That I was going to say it was a total failure?
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Well, actually, a little bit, yes. The existing splines tool for Unity did everything mine did, only better. In addition to solving problems I hadn't even thought of yet. And it would take 5 videos to cover all the advantages of switching to the splines tool. So yes, in the end, my system ended up in the trash and I ended up borrowing this tool. Yoink. Moral of the story. Developing a system from scratch only makes sense in 2 cases. 1. If there is something extremely specific that you can't do with the existing system. Or 2, if you have the time and your goal is to learn. Which I did a lot, but at the cost of an excessive amount of hours that ended up wasted. But, well, I'll use it for my resume and will forget this little stumble so we can move on to the second month of development. Now that I had re-implemented the new spline system, which also made it easier for me to create the track mesh procedurally, another point for the system I didn't create, alright, let's go. I moved on to create my controller for the vehicle,
Yeah, boy.
which started as a simple move towards loop that traverses the spline. Simple but effective. Then I thought that although I would love to be able to use a rigid body and have the car apply realistic physics by default, like when taking curves and generating that drift, not everything was going to be that easy. And this time it did make sense to create my own physics system. And in the process I thought I have two options. I can simulate the physics with realistic physical formulas. Or could I fake the physics to rotate the car based on certain parameters? And this time I opted for the simpler option of faking the physics, which seemed the most optimal at the time and initially did not yield bad results. The car rotated based on the curvature of the spline, giving that drifting effect on the sharper curves. But, well, let's say it didn't quite give that realistic feeling I was looking for. It seemed more like something choreographed, rather than a physical reaction to a force. And since sometimes I get a bit neurotic about details, I couldn't rest easy, so I ended up scrapping everything and redoing it, but this time applying realistic physical formulas. Highlighting the calculation of centripetal force based on the curve's radius and the car's speed, and an opposing resistance force, to determine three cases: the acceleration state, the drift state, and the derailment state, where the car shoots off. In the end, it turned out like this, and without a doubt, the result was much better, although it needed some aspects to be refined. Moral of this second story: don't be lazy or you'll work twice as hard. Here, I show you a more polished version, where you can see how the centripetal force updates and causes a drift when it exceeds that resistance force, and another limit resistance force that would cause derailment. This representation greatly helped improve the system to the point where we started having fun with the movement, and it was visually very appealing. At this point, I started preparing an initial demo with some special cars. Leave a comment if you recognize any of them. And I added a quick competition mode where I prepared a very simple version for some chairs against which to compete against. And this is where fear took over my body. What I didn't notice before because the camera was closely following the player, or rather at the same speed, I now noticed in the movement of the chairs, which were moving at different speeds than the main camera. The movement was jerky, and not precisely due to FPS drops, it was because of the movement being applied. A few hours after the cold sweat subsided, I started considering possibilities for why this might be happening to me. And I finally concluded that, although I was interpolating the movement between points, it was still moving the car from one point, from point A to point B, which caused a noticeable jerk between each point and the next. Now, it was time to think about how to traverse the points without actually traversing them. And the only possible solution was not doing it. No, but seriously, the solution was simple. Instead of programming the car to move from point A to point B, program it to start at point A and give it an updated direction that points towards the next point B, in this case. Sounds good, but of course, this is a real game, and it wouldn't look too good if the car started to deviate too much from its next point, which would happen if the direction wasn't updated quickly enough and it started going in a direction that wasn't entirely correct towards the next point. And this is the point we find ourselves at. So currently, we are facing a challenge from which we will emerge. Although, from the last attempts, I couldn't tell you when, but we will definitely come through. And well, if you like this project and want to support me, you can already add it to your wishlist on Steam to to stay updated on its final release. We would love to know what you think about the idea, what game modes you would like to see, and any suggestions for improvement. Leave your comments, give it a like, and subscribe, so you don't miss the upcoming updates. Thank you very much for joining me today in this first devlog. See you next month with the continuation of Speed Rivals. Bye! And wish us luck, please.